Welcome to Levant TV's press review for Wednesday, 27th of November. I'm Carmen Cracknell, and today we will be taking a look at the Syrian crisis, as well as Egypt's political turmoil amid announcements for a referendum in January. But first, let's take a look at papers here in the UK. The Guardian leads its front page with Andrew Mitchell accusing the police officer at the centre of the Plebgate row in Downing Street of not telling the truth, as the former chief whip claims his reputation is under attack. It also pays tribute to its crossword compiler John Graham, alias Araucaria, who died aged 92 by printing his photograph superimposed onto his last puzzle. Time to go is the answer to one clue, it notes. The Independent's front page is also dedicated to Mr. Mitchell, as it describes the re-emergence of the Plebgate row as spokes, lies and videotape. Mr. Mitchell is pictured outside his North London home before Crown Prosecution Services announced that no charges would be brought against the Downing Street officers. The Daily Telegraph leads its front page looking at the NHS, calling for an army of Good Samaritans to check on lonely elderly neighbours during the cold winter, after recent reports that too many pensioners end up in hospital due to neglect. It also features a picture of celebrity chef Nigella Lawson after an email from her ex-husband, Charles Saatchi, aired in court, describing her as being off her head on drugs, along with the couple's daughter. The Times also features Lawson on their front page, reporting on accusations made against her of allowing two of her aides in spending hundreds of thousands of pounds on a company credit card in exchange for keeping her alleged use of drugs a secret. It also features reports on Prime Minister David Cameron's latest announcement that migrants from EU countries will be barred from claiming out-of-work benefits for 3 months after arrival, as Brussels is set to challenge the Prime Minister's crackdown. Now let's take a look at the top stories in the Middle East. With peace talks on their way, and as the Syrian situation develops, let's take a look at the latest updates on the conflict. Edward Dark, the pseudonym for a Syrian residing in Aleppo, has written an article for Al Monitor titled "Aleppo Gears for Major Regime Offensive," which discusses the anticipated retaking of vital areas in Aleppo by regime forces. Explaining recent troubles experienced by rebel groups, the author writes that Turkey tightened its border controls after ISIS took over adjacent territory. The rebels' problems were exacerbated by internal fighting, with ISIS going after various rebel brigades, which significantly weakened the rebels in the northern countryside. Dark added that all these are contributing factors to the rebels' string of defeats, but the most significant one is the defection of former rebels who helped the regime retake the strategic Mawassalat Haditha area. The author added that regime forces were very close to rebel-controlled areas of Aleppo, and that if they managed to take, they effectively skewer and divide the rebel parts of the city, cutting them off from one another and from vital supply lines. Referencing the upcoming Geneva II talks, the author wrote that the timing seems to be calculated to make as many gains on the ground as possible ahead of Geneva II talks, tentatively scheduled for mid-December. No doubt significant victories in Aleppo will strengthen the regime's hand and give it more bargaining leverage, as well as enabling it to make fewer concessions, he said. Regarding a potential regime victory in Aleppo, the author added, many people here, not just regime supporters, are hopeful that this latest regime offensive might drive the rebels out of the city, or at least see them relinquish large parts of it. An op-ed piece by Hayat Alvi in the Jerusalem Post titled "The Merger of Jihad Franchises in Syria, a War of Islamisms" discusses the multiple divisions between rebel forces. The article notes that in addition to jihadist groups fighting against more secular rebel factions, various rebel groups are set to create a new Islamic Front merger. The announcement of the new Islamic Front may also challenge the growing influence of the two al-Qaeda-affiliated jihadist rebel groups, the al-Nusra Front and the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, also known as ISIS. Alvi views the Syrian conflict as a spider web-like network of Sunni and Shia militias and paramilitary forces, and this can only continue to plunge Syria into violence and chaos, not unlike the Lebanese civil war. The author views all sides of the conflict as guilty of war crimes, adding that the supporters of these groups, these proxy rebel groups like Saudi Arabia, the UAE and other GCC states on the Sunni jihadist side and Iran on the Shia side, have no regard for the innocent civilians suffering horrifically in Syria and also as refugees in neighbouring countries. Describing the Syrian civil war as the Afghanistan of the Middle East, Alvey foresees a mirror effect of what occurred following the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. This merger of Islamic rebel groups and the power struggles between the Islamic Front and the Al-Qaeda-affiliated jihadist groups portend a similar outcome to Afghanistan after the Soviets withdrew. As talks around the Geneva II conference continue, Arab News has published an article by Osama al-Sharif titled "Geneva II will not bring an end to Syria's ordeal." Sharif writes that the road to Geneva will be fraught with challenges and that while Assad has announced his readiness to attend the talks, the SNC has boycotted the conference, adding, "The Syrian opposition has failed over the years to present a united front. It suffers from internal divisions and outside interferences. It has lost the support of key rebel groups fighting the regime. Its attempts to create a provisional government in liberated areas has failed. Its repeated calls for arms and munitions from the West were never treated seriously." Sharif added that the regime has a renewed sense of confidence, which has frustrated the opposition, especially when the US shifted its position in the past few weeks and embraced an offer by Damascus to dismantle its chemical weapons, following its cooperation with UN inspectors. Regarding the US towards Syria, Sharif wrote, "Washington was never able to chart a consistent policy on Syria, especially on the issue of arming the resistance. The lack of coherent policy has stymied the influence of the moderate Syrian Free Army and allowed religious extremists to play a more decisive role." Sharif said of the upcoming Geneva II, "Washington and Moscow now agree on the need to hold a peace conference in Syria next month in Geneva, despite the fact that the opposition is unlikely to attend. No one is talking about regime change anymore." Regarding a potential Syrian leadership change, the author wrote, "Prospects for a deal that would loosen Assad's grip on power in Syria appear weak at best. The opposition's goals for Syria are contradicted by the actions of extremists on the ground, and if they fail to show up in Geneva, the US and its Western allies can always claim to have tried their best to find a political solution." The author concludes that the real losers in the conflict are the Syrian people and that starvation of civilians and sectarian killings have become the norm. He finishes by saying that Geneva II could pave the way for the rehabilitation of the Assad regime at a time when US attention is shifting towards concluding a historical deal with Iran over its nuclear program. As Hazem Bablawi, the interim Prime Minister in Egypt, announces a referendum on Egypt's amended constitution is likely to take place in January, let's take a look at what analysts are saying on the current situation in Egypt. Writing for Daily News Egypt, Dr. A. Helia asks, "How many times does Egypt have to do this to get it right?" Helia says, "In 3 years, Egyptians have seen events repeat themselves again and again. They're about to see it happen again with this forthcoming constitutional referendum, a recurrence of a bad set of decisions yet again." Helia said there are certain steps that are meant to be taken in a constitution that occurs after an uprising that leads to a revolution, referring to the revolution of the 25th of January in 2011, which never had the constitution it deserved. He says essentially 7 out of 10 Egyptians couldn't be bothered to vote one way or the other. That's not a constitutional process anyone should be proud of, because it shows clearly the Egyptian people were generally not interested in the yes camps argument or the no camps. Helia says that with military-backed interim cabinet issuing a statement earlier this week that the referendum would take place in the second half of January, with a draft presumably ready in December sometime, We can look forward to numerous discussions on television programmes, civil society meetings, cafe shop conversations, family gatherings, and so on. However, according to Helia, we should not be looking forward to that in the slightest, because just like last time, this vote shan't be decided on the merits of the draft. This constitutional referendum is a part of the roadmap General Sisi put in place, and it is the first vote within that roadmap. No other vote has taken place, despite some suggesting that it would have been a good idea to have a referendum on the roadmap in order to establish a secure legitimacy for the path taken forward. Helia adds that when people go to the polls in January, it is entirely likely to be as simply as this. If you support the military, then you'll vote yes, as a yes to the roadmap the military backs. One wonders if the Muslim Brotherhood and its supporters will mobilise for a no vote. He goes on to ask, does that mean Egypt is likely to see something of a repeat of last year's vote, where around 70% of the electorate stayed at home, but the constitution passed anyway? One cannot be sure. But it's clear that within the government itself, already many concerns are being raised about the turnout. Answering where that leaves Egyptians, Helia thinks it leaves them waiting for a constitution that few are likely to feel much value for as an actual document. Turnout will probably be better than last year, particularly if the military comes out in support of even participating in the referendum. But, he adds, that's hardly an accomplishment in and of itself. A real accomplishment would have been a process that all sectors of society brought into and debated from the grassroots up. Yes, it would have taken longer, but Egypt then would be voting on a constitution as opposed to voting on who created a process to make one. Writing for Egypt's Ahram, Hassan Abu Talib writes, from Cairo to Moscow, welcome Putin, as he says Egypt's real interests lie in balanced relations with all world powers. Thus, boosting Cairo's relations with Moscow cannot be an alternative remedy to Egypt's frustrating relationship with the US. Abu Talib says, when I read statements by Russian foreign minister about the visit by himself and Russia's defense minister to Cairo in preparation for a higher level visit, I recall the events of the 30th of June. Egyptian citizens in several squares raised pictures of Presidents Abdel Nasser, Sadat and Russian President Putin alongside General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. He adds, other Egyptians raised posters ridiculing US President Obama in a scene that denoted many important positions. While they respected and appreciated President Putin, Obama was mocked and criticised. While people shouted demands for Putin to visit Cairo, they also damned US policies and politicians for not being trustworthy or reliable. Abu Talib says a strong Egyptian public mood was formed, demanding an end to the hostage relationships with Washington and the West, and turning towards other countries, especially major ones. The idea simply is twofold. First, a call to end the special relationship with the US that has proven itself unreliable at a critical point of transformation for Egyptians. They had expected the US to clearly support, back and endorse their sweeping popular revolution. Second, a call to review history and recall the positives in terms of strong friendship, support and credibility. Abu Talib says turning to Russia is nothing new in Egyptian policies, and today it appears to be critically needed. It is important that we do not repeat the same mistakes that pushed Egypt in the past to ignore Moscow and suffice with the West and Washington. What is clearly needed is that no one should think that revitalizing relations with Russia, led by the shrewd Putin, is an alternative remedy to Egypt's frustrating relationship with the US. Neither does Russia want this, nor will the US and the West accept it, and Egypt will not benefit from replacing one party with another. Abu Talib believes that Egypt's real interests lie in balanced relations with all world powers, taking from everyone, interacting with everyone, and giving to everyone. At that point, Egypt and Egyptians will have a completely different standing, something we have already gleaned in many European and US transformations, supporting the roadmap and Egypt's new reality. He concludes that no doubt Egypt needs Russia's friendship, a friendship that reflects a shared determination to build and share balanced gains. In short, the issue with the new Russia is not an arms deal, despite its strategic importance and significance, but a will and leadership to pioneer, which is open competition for everyone. Turkey's Star Gazette Semih Yildiz looks at Egypt's decision to expel the Turkish ambassador, as he says Ankara to blame for Egypt expelling Turkish ambassador. Yildiz says Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan's attitude towards Egypt may please his AKP voters, but the point we have reached with Egypt comes at a time of important developments in the Middle East. According to Yildiz, however you look at it, for a major Arab country to expel the Turkish ambassador and to minimise diplomatic relationships with Turkey is a diplomatic failure. He adds, when Turkey sent back its ambassador after a short while, Egypt did not respond in kind. This was Cairo's way of saying, you were forced to send back your ambassador, but nobody can force us. Yildiz believes there are reasons behind Egypt's confidence in taking this step against Turkey. The primary reason is that no other country in the region except Turkey denounces the Egyptian army for toppling the Muslim Brotherhood. He adds that one doesn't have to be a genius to understand that the West is guided by interests in its foreign relations. Whether we like it or not, that is the basis of international relations. The West, grasping with the realities of the Middle East, agreed to get along with the military rule in Egypt. Yildiz highlights that Ankara is again trying to return as an active player to the Middle East, where it has fallen to precious loneliness because of its misguided policies, even if it means following in the wake of US policy. Now let's take a look at the top headlines from international papers. Russia's Moscow Times leads its front page with the headline, Putin slams EU criticism on Ukraine after Ukraine's decision to freeze preparations for a trade deal with Europe in favour of tighter ties with Russia. Washington Post leads its front page with the headline, The Sacrifice Before the Feast, as the US prepares for Thanksgiving. The UAE's Gulf News leads with the headline, Dubai makes health cover compulsory. And finally, China Daily leads its front page with the headline, Li looks to closer relations as China, Central and Eastern Europe vow to double trade in 5 years. That was it for today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for another press review.